Hello, and welcome to the Flights of Fancy podcast, the podcast where we talk about military aviation and combat aircraft. I'm your host, Mr. O. Today's episode revolves around the brainchild of two men. On the left, we have Alexei Mikhailovich Isayev, and on the right, we have Alexander Yakovlevich Bereznek, both of which were in the early stages of their careers at the time of this specific aircraft when it comes to aircraft design. Now, both of these gentlemen would hold prominent positions in the post-war world, with Bereznak heading MKB Raduga, specializing in tactical missiles, whereas Isayev appears to have been a prominent engine designer within his partner's bureau. So their goal was to create a rocket-propelled aircraft for the Soviet Air Force, using new developments in the field and inspiration and knowledge gained from the tests made by Leonid Dushkin and his team, who had worked on the RP-318 rocket-enhanced fighter plane. These tests were conducted from 1936 into the 1940s, although there appears to be no specific date mentioned for when it was cancelled. It is, however, noted that it flew 9 times, but whether this is on its own power or simply being airborne remains unclear. Rocket-propelled aircraft in the USSR can be traced back to the BICH-11 designed by Boris Cheranovsky as the first purpose-built rocket aircraft, but it was unsuccessful due to the unsafe nature of the engine proposed. The BICH-11 would fly, but not by its intended means. Which brings us back to the topic of the day, the Bereznyak-Isayev BI-1. Isayev had been a designer on the RP-318 team, and Bereznak had helped design a high-speed aircraft project along with one Viktor Bolkovitnov, who himself had attained prominence as the head of design bureau OKB 293. Now, one side note to mention with regards to OKBs, these are essentially state design bureaus, and for the most part, because of at the time, Stalin's purges and other nasty effects of the Soviet regime at the time, a lot of these designs bureaus actually had they were made up of political prisoners or intelligentsia who weren't necessarily there on their own free will. Now, regardless of that specific part, these design bureaus did produce some rather astonishing results. And as we come across other designs, especially at this time of in the Soviet Union's history, we'll be able to go in a little bit deeper on those topics. By spring 1941, Bereznak and Isayev would be working together and given permission to go ahead with the designing process of the BI-1. Now, Bereznyak had already completed the basic design, which essentially helped speed up the entire process, and official approval by Stalin was given in or around July 1941. 1941 obviously is a pretty tumultuous time for both the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. In July, they're losing a lot of territory to the German invaders or Nazis, and this was a sort of period where even if designs were not necessarily sound in some senses, or may not have had the proper ironing out phases of them, they would still be pushed forward because any fighter is better than no fighter, for example. Now, as mentioned, it's a rather hectic time for the Soviet Union, and it's exemplified by the requirement to build the aircraft in just 35 days. So there's some hearsay as to whether or not the official approval was given on the 1st of August of that year, or if it was slightly before, or if the designers were given a little bit of advance notice to start working on the design. But regardless of all that, it was still a phenomenal feat to be able to construct a plane in such a small time frame. As mentioned, the official day of the order was set on the 1st of August 1941, although work had already been previously completed. Um, to be able to complete your aircraft in such a short amount of time, some sources even state that they were all pulling triple shifts, essentially had been living at the factory in which they worked. By the time that the 35 days had elapsed, two unpowered prototypes had been created. Now, the first flight, albeit unpowered, took place on the 10th of September 1941, and once more, setbacks occurred when the Nazi forces were approaching the factory grounds of OKB 293, and so they were evacuated to the Urals. By January 1942, the first engine would be installed into an airframe, but suffered a small explosion a month later during ground tests. Um, Mentions of these tests that I can find state that several of the scientists were injured, as well as the main test pilot for the project. There's discrepancy as to who flew which BI on what day. There are some sources that are a little bit more authentic than others, which helps ground it a little bit. But to me, there seems to be a little bit too much mystery to really nail down all the specific tests and all the specific pilots. In any case, um, the the one takeaway that should be noted from the ground explosion is that rocketry is quite dangerous, and much more so at the time because there was just fewer experiments had been done. They're working with a lot of new materials, and the exact effects of all these things coming together wasn't very well known. This isn't to say that, in essence, rocketry in a modern day sense is um, less volatile. It's just that it's more safe. There's more safety protocols. We have a better understanding of the various fuels at play, and so on. It wouldn't be until the 15th of May 1942 that the first real flight of the BI 1 would take place. It would reach a maximum speed of 400 kilometers an hour using a D-rated engine that provided power three times less than was originally hoped for back in early 1941. Due to the nature of rocket power, flights never lasted very long. You typically want to underload the aircraft just so that if something happens, you're not going to immediately explode into a giant ball of flame. The engine that was initially proposed had was supposed to have a engine power of about 3,090 foot-pounds, whereas the one used in the actual tests were 1,100 foot-pounds, or pounds of thrust, I should say. Um, in this slide, we have footage of the actual flights that had taken place, and essentially the only known footage, as far as I know, of the BI-1. Should mention that the BI-1 is the name for the overall design, and there's confusion between the specific aircrafts being labeled different names based on their tail number, or more specifically, sometimes it's attributed to the variant. Another thing to mention is that the fate of a lot of the BI-1s are unknown. The ones that seem to exist in modern times all seem to be replicas or reconstructions rather than any preserved example. Judging by the footage as well, we know that this is taken from obviously many different flights. We have two on the tail of this aircraft, whereas the previous one had a three on its tail. as well as there being reports that on landing, on I believe two separate occurrences, the landing gear either broke or malfunctioned and caused some damage. So we don't see that here. Now, the BI-1 was at first envisioned to carry four machine guns, but this was changed later to 20 millimeter cannons during the initial design phase. The reason for this is that it was deemed, machine guns were deemed to not be very effective in an offensive sense, and the Soviet Air Force had typically moved to at least having one, if not multiple, 20 millimeter cannons to supplement offensive firepower. As previously mentioned, it was hoped that the engine used would provide some 3,000 pounds of thrust, but the maximum attained would fall short at 2,430 pounds of thrust. Issues arose due to the highly corrosive nature of the fuel used, and flights didn't actually resume until 1943. Unfortunately, disaster struck in March when BI-3, piloted by G. Yakovlev Bakhchivandzhy, crashed during a test flight. Records and instruments from the crash show that he had reached speeds exceeding 800 kilometers an hour, speeds that caused loss of control due to the transonic flow of air, a phenomenon that was scarcely understood at the time. The reason being is that, well, aircraft didn't fly fast enough for anybody to really know what was beyond. You see this issue exhibited also with the United States forces when they had problems with aircraft such as the A-36 Mustang, as well as the P-38, where the pressures involved would cause um, loss of control and planes just nosediving into the ground. And unfortunately, with crashes like that or problems with regards to control, the G forces and associated forces that are pressing down on your controls are also being pressed down on your pilot, and so survival was rare. Because of this, there wasn't really any way to um, communicate knowledge of what was going on to technicians for them to test these things. So, what would end up happening, or what eventually would happen, is you'd have to transfer airframes or aircraft into wing tunnel tests. Now, thankfully for the Soviet Union, they had the necessary wind tunnels at Sagi. So they had sent an aircraft, specifically BI-6, and this aircraft was tested in numerous different configurations. If you watch Formula One racing, you can kind of see how they use different strips to see just how wind is essentially having an effect on the airframe. So these strips they should all be paper, I believe, paper cardboard. I forget specifically. And essentially, you're looking for deviations if any of them fall off or have issues, etc. The BI-1 as a design was also tested with two ramjets, as we can see in the bottom right, but it doesn't seem to have gone all that far. The ramjet configuration was attempted in flying trials as well, but there seems to have been problems where the system could the pilot could never manage to turn both ramjets on at the same time, and so further development was essentially dropped at some point. Now, the combat capabilities of the BI-1 revolved around the twin 20 millimeter cannons, um, but it was also planned to have a container that would show up below the cockpit. Now, unfortunately, having having some sort of visual is a little harder. I think there's one image out there that might show it, and I do have it in the next slide. But since we're here, there's a container that's about here, maybe a little bit further back. And essentially, the container has 10 thermite bombs in it. And the idea is that as your aircraft is, we'll say, flying in a yonder direction, we'll put some tail here, there. So as your plane is flying over your enemy bombers, you drop the bombs in front of them, and your opponent ends up flying into them. Now, this isn't a great system. You could use it for ground attacks as well, but again, the system was never really perfected, and so it was dropped. The other problem too is that you only have 10 thermite bombs. You can't really drop them in any effective pattern, and as as was experienced by various nations during the development or as they developed their own rocket powered aircraft, the problem was that your closing speed to opponent or enemy aircraft is so great that any sort of accurate drop, especially of bombs, is very, very hard to achieve. 20 millimeter cannons is hard enough to aim at a target, as you'd have to calculate lead and be able to effectively place shots on target. And any miscalculation obviously gives you no result, and the BI-1, as with other rocket-powered aircraft, doesn't necessarily have a lot of flying time. Now, we also have a nice little internal diagram of the aircraft. So the engine takes up a lot of space, and a lot of the fuel supply takes up much of the internal space as well. So there's a lot of tubes, there's a lot of combustion chambers and um, mixing areas in order to get a proper fuel flow. And uh, suffice to say that in the early stages of rocket-powered aircraft, uh, getting this sort of perfect ratio and doing it safely, it's a tough thing to achieve. I should also mention that at least one source mentions the application of two RS-82 rockets, though I've never quite seen anything that even depicts it. I don't believe they're even shown on this diagram or this these two diagrams. So we can see on the top left here there are supposed to be some AA bombs that would be in a container, be dropped from it, but that never seems to have fully materialized. As well, I don't believe that, or at least I'm not entirely sure if all of these various variants are necessarily um, individual aircraft, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Um, but suffice to say that we can see that there are at least uh, we have aircraft one, aircraft two, number three below, five and six. Um, in total, well, we don't see number four, but for all of the airframes that were ever built, nine of them in total, it doesn't seem there are certain airframes that don't seem to have much information about them. Period. Even though we know they were built, um, for example, BI-8 is a complete mystery. Nobody knows, or at least I couldn't find any source that pointed to the whereabouts or what it might have been tested for, or so on. Um, Comparatively, at least to the rest in its lineage. So BI-1, built in September of 1941, retired in 1942 due to damage from corrosive fuels. Um, can't stress enough how the fuels used were highly corrosive. Um, and so you really had to be careful not to or to check to make sure that no pipes leak and you don't have any bursts from anything. Now BI2, although literature describes the BI1 as having the first two airframes built in 1941, there's no specific date. So I'm not quite sure if BI2 was built at the same time as BI1, or if it just happened to be built in a reasonable time frame after the first one. BI3, as mentioned, was lost on its fourth flight due to the transonic flight effect, which sadly killed its test pilot. BI4 is mentioned to have been tested with armament, although the limited trials seem to have been accomplished with any sort of armament whatsoever. I don't believe the AA bombs were ever used, or the thermite bombs. I don't know if the rockets were ever tested, but it appears that the cannons, at least to some degree, were tested. Now, the BI5 was modified to be similar to the BI7, so having an RD1 engine, but just or having the same characteristics, just no engine, just so that it could test fluttering issues. It appears that one of the test pilots had reported that there was some stability issues and loss of control, but it never seems to have been able to be rectified. Other tests that were done, the test pilots couldn't tell what if there was any issues whatsoever. Now, as mentioned, BI6 was sent to the Tsagi wind tunnels. It performed tests there. Um, it was sent back and was tested in flight with its ramjets, but those never seemed to have amounted to any further development. BI8 is a complete mystery, and BI9 was renumbered BI6, which is why it's hard to nail down specifically which airframe is which at times. If other airframes, such as the BI8, were ever renumbered, it's not mentioned, or at least I couldn't find any sources about it. And it makes it a little bit more of a trial to figure out which may be which. Now, production was planned for 30 to 50 examples. This was earlier on in its lifetime. Um, However, the prolonged development time of the airframe itself meant that and the turning tide of the war meant that there was no more of a need for the BI itself. Other aircraft, such as the Yak 3, the Yak 9, Yak 7, etc., as well as, well, maybe not MiG's designs, but also the LA 5 and LA 7 were doing well enough that there didn't appear to be a need for this new radical uh, type of aircraft. As mentioned, there's only 9 airframes built. This is a little confusing because other sources, such as Russian Wikipedia, although source to a degree, only lists 3 as being built. I'm not sure where they get their number or how, if maybe they're only claiming flying types. I'm not quite sure. But there seems to be a discrepancy between numbers reported. Um, Now we know that the BI-1 was likely scrapped instead of retired due to the corrosive fuels and not really necessarily needing to preserve the aircraft. Um, the other intact airframes, as we cannot count number 3, all seem to have been scrapped as well. Um, all of the photos that I've seen of existing examples for the most part, we'll label them as replicas or, as previously mentioned, reconstructions, but nothing seems to have been, there doesn't seem to have been any sort of original aircraft that was preserved, which is a little unfortunate when you see a lot of different German tanks and other equipment that has been able to survive into modern times. Now, uh, a little unfortunately, there only really is one comparative aircraft at the time that the BI-1 could have not necessarily dueled, but seen itself as a counterpart to. That being um, the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet. Apologies, I seem to have forgotten to add the names there. Now, the Comet on the right versus BI-1 on the left. The BI-1 was supposed to have a higher rated engine, which did not happen, hence the large discrepancy between foot pounds of thrust between the two. We can also see that uh, the Comet is a slightly more compact in that it's not longer, but its wingspan and height are both larger. This is mainly due to differences in design philosophy. The Comet was built more to was based more on gliders. Gliders have to have a higher wingspan in order to have a higher glide ratio, which would be beneficial in a sense to give the pilot a little bit more time in the sky as they float down back to their airfield. Meanwhile, the BI-1 is designed much more as a combat aircraft, or with the origins of a standard aircraft rather than a glider itself. Now, it's interesting to see the differences in weight as well. I'm not exactly sure why the Comet is so much more so heavier. And sadly, because maximum speeds were never really reached with the BI-1, these top speeds are really just estimates. This isn't to say that it couldn't reach that speed, um, just that it may be very unsafe to do so. The Comet has a bit of a better design to withstand the higher speeds uh, versus the BI-1. They're also incredibly comparable in terms of service ceiling, and armament is obviously in favor of the Comet with a higher bore size, but I'm not entirely sure how much munitions both of them would have individually. I believe the Comet had several different variants in terms of armament. So, one armament, in this case, the 230 millimeter MK or Mark 108 cannons, might have had a little bit more ammunition than, say, a higher or lower or different calibered version. Also, interestingly, the endurance for the BI-1 is twice that of the Comet. I don't think that necessarily does too much um, in comparisons. More that the Comet is seen as a desperate point defense fighter, where it needs to attain its high service ceiling very quickly, and then it can just float back down. And again, kind of why they went with a glider body versus the BI-1, which is, I guess, in a way, more of a plane interceptor, plane as in regular, rather than aircraft. In any case, that is all I have for today on the BI-1. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of the information out there is, generally speaking, all in Russian. So if there's anything that I've sadly translated incorrectly, then I hope that is not the case. Um, there's quite a few books out there that cover the BI-1 at least to a small degree, and I highly suggest grabbing at least Soviet combat aircraft of the Second World War and the Encyclopedia of Russian Aircraft, uh, regardless of which version, if it's the 1875 to 1995 or Bill Gunston's Aircraft of the Soviet Union. Um, all three of those books have quite a few entries, and they're rather good articles on the subject. Also, I kind of glossed over it quite a bit, but if you go to the link of astronautics with regards to the nitric acid and kerosene, those are the fuels that were used in the engine. I'll probably have to do a much larger video or overview on different fuels, although I'm not super well versed in exactly how all of those things combine and how they work together. Just that nitric acid and kerosene can be a rather dangerous combination if not done properly, and that's already been spoken to with regards to an explosive engine. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Next episode will I'm trying to get an episode out on a Rumpler aircraft, which is an aircraft from one designed from World War I. But I'm still waiting for some books in transit, so hopefully they come in time. If not, then I'll just have to pick something else out of a hat. If you're interested in giving me suggestions or dropping me a line, you can find me on Twitter at slash fancy podcast. Consider checking the Patreon if you want to message me there. More than welcome to look into any sort of topic that people want me to talk about. Anyways, as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.